Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Jeremy Hunt's promises of higher spending and lower taxes would exacerbate pressures on public finances. That's the conclusion of the Institute of Fiscal Studies. Has been running its eye over the pledges of the two leaders. Hunt's pledges including cutting corporation tax, increasing defence spending, and they reckon the total bill will be about £36 billion a year. Well, earlier this week, the IFS looked at Boris Johnson's tax cuts and put the price tag at around £20 billion a year. Well, joining me now is Ben Zaranko, who's a research economist at the IFS. So, basically, Jeremy Hunt Prime Minister would be more expensive than Boris Johnson Prime Minister. Is that the conclusion?
I think it's too soon to say, Adam. I think what we have at the moment is a set of policies each candidate has outlined, and we can try and cost what we can and say, given this is how much we think it would cost. In the last few days, since we kind of came out with our initial analysis, Boris Johnson's come forward with some additional areas of spending he might like to boost. But as you say, in the last few days, we've looked at Hunt's proposals. Some of them lack a little bit of precision, so we've kind of tried to give a range. So he talked about raising the national insurance threshold, so the point at which you start paying national insurance. Now, that's quite a good way to help low earners through the tax system. It's possibly the best thing you can do, using a tax system to help those low earners. But he hasn't said exactly what he would raise it to. So for every £1,000 you raise it by, it costs about £3 billion. Dominic Raab suggested raising it to the point at which you start paying income tax, which is £12,500. That would cost around £11 billion. So at the moment, we don't know exactly how much Hunt's policies would cost, but we can give a rough idea. And what we do know is it's quite a big package of tax cuts and spending increases.
Because what his two big proposals, as I understand it, are one, cutting corporation tax, and two, increasing defence spending.
Those are the two big ticket items, I guess, yeah. So on corporation tax, the rate is currently 19%, falls to 17% next year. Jeremy Hunt said he wants to cut it all the way to 12.5%, which would take us to the same level as Ireland, and the joint second lowest level in the OECD. We think that would cost about $13 billion in the short run. Obviously, over the long term, if it encourages business investment, some of that feeds through to higher wages, more profits being shored in the UK, some of that might be offset, but it's not a tax that's going to pay for itself. It's still a big giveaway to businesses.
And the defence spending?
Defence spending, so Jeremy Hunt said he wants to increase spending by about $15 billion to take defence spending from where it is today, about 2% of GDP, which is the NATO level that we commit to as a NATO member, to about 2.5% of GDP. So that would be...
He originally said 4%, didn't he?
He hinted at 4% about a month or so ago. He didn't commit to that firmly. Now, going into a bit more detail, and the $15 billion number is probably the one we're going to focus on for now. That would be a start of a reversal of a trend over multiple decades. So since the Second World War, defence spending as a share of national income has been falling steadily, and that in part has been what's allowed us to pay for a growing welfare state, higher spending on things like the health service and social security, without having to increase overall taxes, and obviously that can't continue. And if in the future, as the population ages, we have more elderly people, they're suffering from more complex health conditions, and we need to meet those pressures, doing that as well as ramping up defence spending could put some pressure on the public finances.
I mean, they're both planning loosening the purse strings a bit, and yet we've got the current Chancellor saying that if we leave without a deal on Halloween, there will be no money.
He has said something along those lines, that's right. So I think both candidates have referred to Philip Hammond's fiscal headroom, which is sometimes referred to as his Brexit war chest, which basically was about $26 billion back in March, which is essentially how much more borrowing we could do and still stick to Philip Hammond's target next year.
But if we leave with an agreement?
So two things, I think, on that. First of all, about 10 to 12 billion of that 26 is going to disappear entirely because of a change in the way we account for student loans. And secondly, as you say, all of that's predicated on a smooth and orderly Brexit, which is current government policy. If we instead shift to a world where it's going to be more of a disorderly, disruptive, maybe a no-deal type Brexit, so more of that could disappear. And that's not to say you couldn't borrow more still. It would just mean you're going to be in breach of your fiscal targets.
So borrowing would have to be where Hunt or indeed Johnson got their money, would it?
It would not have to be, no. They could look at tax rises elsewhere. At the moment, they're for perhaps...
Tell us about those, then.
Well, political reasons, maybe we talk about the tax cuts now, tax rises in future, but they could also think about cutting other areas of spending. What we'd like to see from the candidates is more of an overall picture of their fiscal strategy, maybe how they'd seek to plug that gap, whether it would come from tax rises, more borrowing, or cuts to other areas of government.
OK, that's the Institute of Fiscal Studies. Thank you very much indeed for that.
Because the Tory leadership candidates have been talking about things beyond Brexit, amazingly enough, and they're planning something of what looks like a spending spree. Let's speak to Tom Waters of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who have looked at both leadership contenders' tax and spending plans. Tom, can you take us through the headline spending commitments for Boris Johnson first?
Sure. So the policies we've seen out of Boris Johnson mainly so far have been on the tax side. So he's announced a significant increase in the high rate threshold, so that basically benefits people with incomes over £50,000 a year. And he's also suggested he wants to increase the point at which people start paying national insurance contributions. And so that's currently about £8,500. So any worker earning more than that would gain from that. We haven't seen so much from him yet on the spending side, at least not in the way of sort of concrete proposals. And your view on these spending proposals or tax proposals? Well, what's clear is these policies don't come cheap. The high rate threshold policy would cost about £9 billion. The national insurance policy would be at least £11 billion. And so we're looking at a fairly large increase in government borrowing if this sort of policy did come into place. All right, stay with us because we'll come back to talk about Jeremy Hunt's policies. Let me just show our guests this in the Financial Times, because the article in the Financial Times goes even further in terms of spending proposals. It's saying that Boris Johnson is eyeing up a public spending spree with Sajid Javid, who's obviously dropped out of the race, as Chancellor, in the region of £100 billion of infrastructure fund over 5 years. Tim, have the Tories abandoned fiscal prudence in order to get Brexit?
It was some time ago. That was abandoned quite a while ago when austerity was essentially ended under the May administration. So this isn't a big change.
Well, those figures are quite a big change. I mean, they may have rhetorically said that austerity was over.
One must make the distinction between analysis and comment here. Personally, I'm into fiscal conservatism and discipline, so I would disagree with this. But the counter-argument is, first of all, that if you take the middle-class tax cuts, under the Tories, it was the very well paid and the very poorly paid who tended to get tax cuts. But a lot of people in the middle, because of fiscal drag, ended up paying more tax. So there's an element of just evening up and making it fairer. But also, if you're going to do Brexit, you need some supply and demand there. You need to kickstart the economy. And so the argument is that with, Laffer curve here, when you cut taxes, you tend to get more income. If you cut taxes, particularly things like the big corporation tax cut that Jeremy Hunt is proposing, then you turbocharge the economy and that gets you through Brexit. So frankly, whoever wins this contest, whatever happens, no deal, a deal, or we stay, the economy is probably going to slump a little bit, and that's going to require some government action like tax cuts and spending.
Is this the time to be giving middle-class tax cuts, to quote Tim?
Well, I don't agree with that policy of Boris Johnson. I think we should be looking at measures that will help the low-paid and reduce our tax credit budget, which releases up that money then to reinvest. Like Tim, I am a fiscal conservative, but I also am someone who would want to share the proceeds of growth. And I think, again, one of the reasons why I backed Rory Stewart was that he made that commitment to prudence.
You said under my leadership will be realistic, prudent and sensible.
Yeah.
Right, so have they abandoned... Inevitable, and wouldn't they all say that? But have Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt abandoned that fiscal prudence?
Well, I think the reality is that unless we have a deal, we know that there is some money set aside to deal with no deal, but I would argue that we can only release that money if there's a deal.
What do you make of the spending pledges? Do you like the sound of those, Belinda, and also the tax cuts?
I think, the Tories are in quite a dire situation. They need to dangle a big, juicy carrot to all their Leave voters in the middle-class section that they have, I feel, abandoned.
But do you like the sound of them?
I'm fiscally conservative personally myself as well. However, I do think there needs to be quite a bit of sort of economic creativity and vision around the next year or two as we are possibly heading for big change. So I appreciate the vision there, but we'll just see if it follows through. I mean, he's just trying to get the voters back as well.
Well, what's the Brexit Party trying to do? What are you offering? I mean, surely this is the time. If you're wanting to criticise Conservative economic policy, what is the Brexit Party's economic policy?
I completely agree. In fact, on Sunday, we're having a rally of over 5,500 people.
And what are you telling them?
Well, that's when we are uncovering some of our policies there. So if you'd like to come and listen, it's £2.50 to come and join us. So it would be great to have you there on Sunday.
And do you know what they are?
Well, we've been talking a lot and getting together with fellow MEPs, but also asking all our supporters. We're doing a bottom-up discussion where we're taking their ideas and asking them what they feel, and everything will be...
Right. Now, the last time I had someone from the Brexit Party on, I was also told there was going to be a rally where policies would be unveiled, and obviously not the economic one. So on Sunday, after that, we'll have a complete prospectus on the Brexit Party's policies.
Perhaps not complete. We are still only a few weeks old, so and we do want to make sure...
More than a few weeks now, but yes.
Since April, so yes, a couple of months. And I do think it's right to take our time over...
You might not have much time. There could be a general election coming.
But we have to get it right, and we do have people from different, areas of the political spectrum in our party, and it's really good to find out the common ground of common sense we have between us, and some of our policies will be unveiled on Sunday, and it's very exciting, and come and join us.
Right. What do you think, Charlie, listening to this? Because on the Jeremy Corbyn side, in terms of anti-austerity, this, as Belinda says, could be a big carrot to voters.
What Belinda's going to propose?
No, not Belinda. She was talking about the Tory policies.
OK, now, as far as the 100 billion is concerned of capital expenditure, I don't know what the detail of that is, but that is not a bad idea, it seems to me. Infrastructure, 110 billion. The idea of taking 9 billion of what Philip Hammond has said is a 26 billion headroom, that's a third, and giving it to those who are currently on the highest band of tax and knocking some of them out of that high band of tax seems a very, very bad idea. As I think everybody agrees, the effect of austerity has been that poverty has gone up quite considerably because welfare benefits have gone down. So surely the first thing you would do, if you've said you've brought austerity to an end, is say what you're going to do for those who have most suffered from austerity, rather than saying to those who are in the highest tax bands at the moment, some of you are now going to go out of the highest tax bands. And it makes one doubt what you mean when you say austerity's come to an end.
So, for example, with Mr Hunt's tax cut proposal for corporations, I would really welcome the idea that a lower rate of tax is paid by companies who pay their employees the living wage rather than the minimum wage. And those proposals have been adopted in some other countries. I think there's a 10p difference on the tax rate for those companies that have a corporate responsibility towards their employees and pay them the living wage. And I think those sorts of ideas are really interesting.
What about, I mean, the Resolution Foundation did a thing that indicated that child poverty had gone up dramatically since 2010, and the reason was because welfare cuts had been savage between 2010 and 2019.
It's relative
an indirect effect by corporation tax being reduced seems an incredibly slow way of bringing austerity to an end.
So it's relative.
Relative to what?
It's relative to the average wage. So and wages have been going up. So as wages increase...
But only recently, isn't it, Antoinette? After 10 years of stagnation.
You'd agree with me, wouldn't you? You'd agree with me.
But there has been a freeze on the way that benefits rise, which is lifting this in the next financial year.
All right.
So I think we will see some pressure easing in that.
Let's go back to Tom at the Institute for Fiscal Studies to tell us a bit more about the spending pledges from Jeremy Hunt, and also, Tom, this idea that Tim said that some of these tax and spend policies will sort of pay for themselves.
Yes. So on the tax side first, Jeremy Hunt has also suggested some sort of reduction in national insurance contributions, but there's also this cut in the corporate tax rate. So that's currently at 19%. He wants to move it to 12.5%. That would cost something of the order of £13 billion. Now, it probably would increase the amount of investment in the UK. There's not really any chance of it paying for itself.
Right, Tim, what do you say to that?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I'm actually a fiscal conservative, so here I'm defending something I don't actually agree with. But it is true historically that when you've had significant tax cuts, they very often ended up generating more revenue than they had before. And I mean, the most recent example was the very highest band was taken down, and the government argues that as a consequence of people repatriating income, staying in the country, paying taxes here, spending more, etc., income actually ends up going up to the Treasury. So that is the argument for it. Personally, what I would say at this stage in the contest is no one should be making specific pledges about anything. In fact, do one of two things. Either be incredibly specific, because we need to know the exact details of things. So, for instance, the immigration pledge on the points basis, and does that mean you're getting rid of, is it going to be all points, or is it going to be an element of short-term visas? So either be really specific or don't be specific, because as a Prime Minister, you need lassitude. especially when you're entering a negotiation with the EU. We don't know what the economy is going to be like in 6 months to a year's time. So I think the idea of going to this election right now and saying, I'm going to cut precisely this band's tax by this amount, businesses by this amount, when you don't know what the fiscal picture will be in 6 months to a year's time, I think that's very foolish. And it seems silly to me, on the one hand, when it comes to the Brexit negotiations, everything's on the table. But at this stage in the race, the candidates are going out of their way to take everything off the table.
Well, then,
by signing up to this economic program.
There's 160,000 people in a particular sort of demographic primarily, and they're aiming all their promises at them. So you're getting this completely warped view of fiscal policy because it's only aiming at a small number.
Yeah.
How many of these promises, however specific they are, the corporation tax for business, the higher rate of tax for those people who are in the higher band and want to get out of it, how many of those will we see translated into a budget subsequently?
Although where I would defend
What
them,
do you think, Tim,
there's no denying
about that?
the big
Do you have a
difference
view about
between Labour and the Tories is Tories see themselves as the party of work. So
Yeah.
the reason why they're not addressing this welfare issue is because they see the way that people improve themselves is through work. Therefore, they want a tax system that incentivises
There are
work
the
and makes sure you
disabled.
keeps as much
There
of
are
your
people
money
with children
as
who
possible.
cannot work. All of these people who
this is
Mrs May
true.
has specifically identified. What are you doing about them in the promises that your leaders are making?
They're not, Miley, I'm not a member of the
Well,
Conservative.
you write for the Daily Telegraph.
No, but Antoinette
Aren't
should
they,
be able to
in-house
answer.
paper
I mean,
for
is it the
them?
case now that people are focusing in this contest much more on how tough you can be on Brexit, and when it comes to the economy, you can afford to be a little bit more liberal because they're proving themselves to a Tory tribe in a different way?
Well, I think there is a lot of tough talk on Brexit, and again, that's why I supported a different candidate. I supported a candidate that I felt was being open about some of the choices that our next leader is going to make. And until we know what that choice is, I don't think you can make the spending promises because you don't know what headroom you've got. You don't know, as Tim has said, it's very clear. And on all the evidence that has been published, that if there's a no-deal Brexit, it will have a substantial shock to the economy. And that's one of the reasons why I don't want that to happen.
You said you like the infrastructure.
Well, I don't know.
Element.
I mean, I like the idea of
I like
100
the
billion
idea
on
of
this. Yeah.
There's a risk of Labour being outmanoeuvred here with its own plans from its costed 2017
I can't remember which
manifesto.
of the two profligate Tory soon-to-be Prime Ministers offered the 100 billion. Was it Boris or was it Jeremy Hunt?
Boris Johnson with Sajid
all right,
Javid as the suggested chancellor.
I genuinely think it is a good idea to spend money sensibly, and 100 billion does not sound remotely off the page in relation to that, but I'm not sure it'll ever happen with Boris.
I think he suggested a review of HS2, and
Yeah.
I know certainly that we need to look at HS3 in the north.
Yeah.
So it's not...
Is that
again,
included in his 100 billion?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
In which case it's not that big. Well, it's still a big figure. It's
It
not
is a
that
big
big a
figure.
figure. Plus, HS2 is hated by a lot of that 160,000 people.
So is he for it or against it?
Well, Jeremy Hunt
We
is
don't know.
for it.
I mean,
Jeremy Hunt has said he
But
is
what
for
about
HS2.
Boris? I'm not sure. Are you saying he's for that HS2 or not? We don't know.
It's being reviewed.
OK, right.
Melissa, what are your views on HS2?
We are not so keen on it. I don't believe in the Brexit Party in terms of it being, again, London to the north. We're more focused on the infrastructure between the northern towns. And instead of propping up London again and trying to get so much down to London, we want to make mini Londons in the north and have infrastructure between them rather than always between London. I think, as far as I know.
Right, let's go back to Tom at the IFS. Tom, listening to those pledges from Jeremy Hunt that could cost between 40 and 46 billion pounds, according to you, how do you imagine he would fund that?
Yeah, I think that's a key question. So a lot of that cost comes from increasing defence spending, which costs something of the order of £15 billion a year. And so, we're essentially looking at increases in spending and reductions in tax. And so, kind of logically, what that implies is more borrowing from the government. And so it looks like that's kind of the road that he's going down. Of course, it could be funded by tax rises he hasn't mentioned so far, or spending cuts elsewhere. But at least on kind of the current set of policies, that's what it looks like it would imply.
Well, I bet he won't be mentioning any tax tax rises in this contest, will he, if he wants to stand any chance of winning against or with Tory grassroots members? But what do you think the answer would be, Tim?
One thing that doesn't pay for itself is more defence spending. I think that's an economic rule we can probably all agree on. But nonetheless, the armed forces probably do need modernisation. We do face new threats. We've got problems with Iran, we've got problems with Russia, and we have commitments to make as part of NATO. I think any candidate, including probably even a Labour one, would be talking about defence increases. The interesting question is, where are they going to squeeze? What will they not raise? That's the sort of specifics we need to get out of them in the next few weeks.
All right. Thank you very much, Tom, at the IFS.